Every summer, my family comes together for a week at my grandparents' lake house. It's been a tradition for as long as I can remember: barbecues, fishing, bonfires, and long nights filled with laughter. From the outside, it looks like something out of a nostalgic movie, a picture-perfect gathering of a close-knit family. I always thought these trips were the foundation of our bond, something sacred that kept us together. I'm 34 now, and for the longest time I believed in that illusion. My father, the eldest son, has always been the one in charge. He runs the schedule like clockwork: when the barbecue starts, what night is reserved for old family stories, even what cabins people sleep in. It's always been the way things have always been, and nobody ever questions it. At least, that's what I thought. Growing up, I started noticing small things. My Aunt Linda and her kids, especially Jason, my cousin who's 4 years younger than me, never seemed as excited as the rest of us. They showed up, smiled when expected, participated in activities, but there was always something off. Their laughter didn't match their eyes. The way they interacted with my father and uncle felt forced, like they were walking on eggshells. Last summer, Jason and I sat outside, watching the bonfire. Out of nowhere, he said, "One day, you'll see what this tradition really is." I laughed it off, assuming he was being dramatic. When I pressed him on it, he just shook his head and muttered, "Forget it." This year, something changed. Aunt Linda refused to come. She said it was health-related, but when I called her, she sounded fine. She just seemed exhausted. Not physically, but in a way that made it clear she didn't want to talk about it. That was the first red flag. Then came the second. In the main living area of the lake house, there's an old logbook where we all write down memories from each trip. It's been around for decades, filled with inside jokes, notes about who caught the biggest fish, little scribbles from when we were kids. One afternoon, out of curiosity, I decided to flip through it. Nostalgia, mostly, but then, buried in the pages, I found something that stopped me cold. A single entry, written in frantic, slanted handwriting. It's all a lie. If anyone reads this, ask about the last summer and why it's never mentioned. I checked the dates. The entry was from 15 years ago. I flipped back and forth through the logbook, scanning every page. Every single summer was accounted for, except one. The summer of 2009 didn't exist. I thought it had to be a mistake. Maybe the logbook from that year got lost. Maybe no one remembered to write anything down. But the more I thought about it, the less sense that made. My father never lets traditions slip. He would have made sure something was written. That night at dinner, I casually brought up 2009. The summer I didn't remember. I had always assumed I just didn't go that year. Maybe I was at a summer camp or had a school trip. But when I asked about it, the entire table went silent. My stomach twisted. This wasn't just a forgotten year. This was a year they wanted me to forget. My father and uncle exchanged a glance, barely noticeable but quick enough that I caught it. My mom just sipped her wine and looked down at her plate. Then my dad chuckled and waved it off. That was the year we skipped. Some family members couldn't make it, so we decided to take a break. That was a lie. I knew it as soon as he said it. My uncle changed the subject before I could ask anything else. The conversation moved on, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd stumbled onto something I wasn't supposed to. After dinner, I called Jason. I told him what I found in the logbook, expecting him to be surprised. Instead, there was nothing but silence on the other end. Then a deep sigh. "Meet me in person," he finally said. "There's something you need to know." The way he said it sent a chill through me. We met later that night at a bar in town. Jason looked different, tense on edge. The moment I sat down, he glanced around the room like he was checking for someone. Then, without any hesitation, he said, "You have no idea who our family really is." I laughed, assuming he was joking, but he didn't even crack a smile. He just shook his head and said, "I should have told you sooner. But once you know, there's no going back." The way he looked at me, like he was waiting for me to walk away, to pretend I never asked, made my stomach turn. Whatever this was, it was big. Bigger than I ever could have imagined. Jason sat there staring at his drink, his fingers tapping against the glass. The noise in the bar felt distant, like we were in our own bubble. He looked like he was debating something, shifting in his seat, his jaw tight. Then finally he spoke. It wasn't just a missing summer, it was a cover-up, and I was the only one who didn't know. In 2009, my uncle's wife, Jason's mom, Aunt Marie, vanished. The family's official story was that she packed a bag and left in the middle of the night. To outsiders, the story was more carefully managed. Marie had moved overseas for a fresh start, according to the few social media updates that the family staged under her name. Even if someone had questions, there was no reason to suspect foul play, and no missing person report was ever filed. Jason never believed it. Years later, when he was old enough to start asking questions, he searched public records. Nothing. No report. No sign that anyone ever tried to find her. It was like she never existed. But Jason remembered that summer, Marie had been at the lake house. She was there, until she wasn't. He started piecing things together as he got older. Every time he brought her up, the family shut him down. The answers were always the same: she left. Don't ask. Let it go. One time, he pushed too hard. His dad, usually a quiet man, snapped at him, told him he'd regret digging into things that weren't his business. That was when Jason stopped asking. But then, a year after Marie disappeared, Jason overheard Grandma talking to my dad. It was late at night, and they didn't know he was there. Poor woman. Grandma had muttered. She was just too curious. Jason never forgot that. Marie had found something she wasn't supposed to, and Jason was convinced that's why she was gone. The more I listened, the colder the air around me felt. Then Jason said something that made my stomach drop. There was a locked basement in the lake house. A storage area. Small, barely noticeable. It had always been locked, and no one was allowed inside. As kids, we never thought much about it. It was just one of those weird rules that no one questioned. But Jason swore that summer, Marie had started asking about it, and after that, she was gone. We both sat there, letting everything settle. Then, without even discussing it, we both knew what we had to do. We were going back to the lake house. It was almost midnight when we pulled up to the house. The place was dark, the only light coming from the moon reflecting off the water. During the day, the lake house was warm, full of life. At night, it felt like something else entirely. We moved fast, parking down the road and cutting through the trees. The less noise, the better. Inside, everything looked the same. The same furniture, the same framed photos, the same old wooden floor that creaked in all the familiar spots. But now, it felt different. Like the walls knew what we were here for. We went straight to the basement door, locked. Jason already knew it would be. He checked the usual spots, above the door frame, under the rug nearby, inside the small cabinet next to it. Nothing. Then he paused, like something clicked in his head. His father always had a set of keys on him. He never left them unattended, but there was one exception. In the shed out back, there was an old fishing vest his dad always wore. He hadn't used it in years. If the keys were anywhere, they'd be there. We slipped outside, making our way to the shed. The door was stiff but eventually gave way. The smell of damp wood and rust filled the air. Jason found the vest hanging on a nail, dust-covered and stiff. He searched the pockets. Nothing. Then, at the very bottom of the vest, his fingers brushed against something cold. Keys. Back inside, we wasted no time. Jason tried the keys one by one until, click, the door creaked open. We stepped inside. The air was thick with dust. Shelves lined the walls, full of old tools, paint cans and boxes of junk. It looked like a normal storage room, except for the wooden chest in the corner. It was small but heavy-looking, with rusted metal latches. Locked. We weren't leaving without opening it. Jason pulled out a crowbar from his backpack. He wedged it under the latch and pushed. The wood groaned but didn't give. He pushed harder. The latch snapped, the lock breaking with it. The chest creaked open. Inside were stacks of old documents, papers yellowed with age. Some were folded, others crumpled, like they had been handled in a hurry. Jason picked up the first thing he saw. A letter. The handwriting was rushed, desperate. Marie's, and right at the top, underlined twice, were the words, "If you're reading this, it means I was right. They won't let me leave. Don't trust them. Whatever they tell you, it's a lie. Get out." Jason's hands trembled as he turned the letter over. There were more notes scribbled on the back, names, dates, too much to take in at once. Then I saw something else. Photographs. One of them was of Marie standing at the dock. Her expression was stiff, not smiling. Behind her, just barely visible in the background. My father. Jason grabbed another stack of papers, flipping through them. Bank statements. Large sums of money moving between accounts. Then something even stranger. A name written over and over again in Marie's frantic handwriting. Elliot Grayson. We had no idea who he was, but Marie sure as hell thought he was important. Before we could process anything, we heard a noise. A floorboard creaked. Then footsteps. Someone was upstairs. The footsteps above us were slow, deliberate. Someone was moving through the house, and they weren't in a hurry. Jason and I barely breathed, frozen in place as we listened. Then, a floorboard creaked near the basement door. Jason moved first, quickly shutting the chest. We pressed ourselves against the shelves, trying to stay out of sight. The only light came from the dim glow of Jason's phone screen. The basement door opened. A flashlight beam swept across the room, bouncing off the dust particles in the air. The light lingered for a second on the chest before moving on. Heavy footsteps followed, making their way down the stairs, slow and steady. Then the flashlight turned toward us. My father stood in the doorway. He didn't look surprised. He didn't even look angry. But there was something else in his expression, resignation, like he had been expecting this day to come. He could have stopped us, but instead, he stepped aside, knowing that whatever we had already found, it was too late to erase it entirely. The flashlight in his hand cast sharp shadows along the walls, making the space feel even smaller. Jason stepped forward first. His voice was steady, but there was something in it I hadn't heard before. He asked about Marie. My father didn't answer. Instead, he looked down at the chest, then back at us. "I hoped you'd never find out," he finally said. "But now that you have, I can't let this go unanswered." His voice was calm, but the meaning was clear. "You'll leave, and you'll forget this, or I will make sure you do." Jason clenched his fists, but I knew we weren't going to win this fight here. He wasn't threatening us. Not outright, but the weight behind his words was enough. Jason didn't back down. He demanded to know the truth about his mom, about what really happened in 2009. Still, my father said nothing, but the way he stood there, not denying it, not correcting him, It was an answer in itself. Jason clenched his fists. I could hear his breathing getting heavier, his muscles tensing like he was about to do something. Before he could, my father spoke again. Leave now. Never ask about Marie again, or you'll end up just like her. The room went silent. Jason took a step forward, but I grabbed his arm. This wasn't the time. My father was blocking the only exit. There was nothing we could do here except get out in one piece. Jason was shaking with anger, but he didn't move. Then, without another word, my father stepped aside. That was the moment I realized he wasn't asking us to leave. He was letting us. But for how long? We didn't speak as we walked past him, up the basement stairs, through the empty house. The second we stepped outside, we broke into a sprint toward the car. The second Jason turned the key in the ignition, I finally exhaled. We drove in silence. The chest was still in the basement. The letter, the photos, the financial records. But we had grabbed a few things. Jason had Marie's letter, and in my hands I was holding the photograph of her standing on the dock. The one where she looked terrified. The one where my father was standing behind her, expressionless. Jason pulled the car into his driveway. Neither of us got out right away. We sat there staring at the letter in Jason's hands. Marie's handwriting was rushed, like she had written it in a hurry. Jason, if you ever find this, it means I was right. They won't let me leave. Don't trust them. Whatever they tell you, it's a lie. Get out. There were more notes scribbled in the margins. Names, dates, fragments of something bigger, and one name circled over and over again. Elliot Grayson. Jason looked it up immediately. Nothing. No social media, no business listings, no old news articles. It was like the name didn't exist, except Marie had written it repeatedly. Jason pulled out the other papers we had grabbed from the chest. Some of them were financial records, listing large sums of money moving between different accounts. The transactions always followed the same pattern. Money going in but never coming out. Shell companies. Money laundering. Marie had found something big, and someone had made sure she never talked about it. A week passed. We kept our heads down, acted normal. I still hadn't spoken to my father since that night in the basement. Jason was barely sleeping. Every time we met up, he looked more exhausted than before. Then one morning, Jason called me. His voice was different, flat. When I got to his apartment, he was holding his phone, staring at an email. A financial report had been sent to him from an unlisted email address. It was a breakdown of transactions between several companies, dating back 15 years. At the bottom, a name stood out, Elliot Grayson, and attached to the email was a single sentence. You're not the first to look for him. Jason's hands tightened around his phone. We weren't stopping now. The drive back from the lake house was silent. Jason gripped the steering wheel, his jaw locked, his eyes focused straight ahead. My father's words played on a loop in my head. Leave now, and never ask about Marie again, or you'll end up just like her. A threat, or maybe a warning. Either way, it meant one thing. We weren't supposed to know the truth. When we got back to Jason's apartment, we locked the doors and dumped everything we had onto the table. The letter, the photograph of Marie at the dock, the financial records, and that one name over and over again. Elliot Grayson. We searched online. Nothing. No social media. No news articles. No obituaries. It was like the name didn't exist. But we had proof it did. Marie had written it repeatedly in her notes. One of the financial records even listed Grayson Holdings, a company we'd never heard of before. The numbers didn't make sense. Large amounts of money being moved in, but never out. No transactions. No withdrawals. No listed employees. A shell company. Marie must have figured it out, and if she disappeared because of it, then we were now on the same path she was on 15 years ago. Jason barely spoke as he flipped through the notes again, scanning for anything we missed. Then suddenly he stopped. His fingers hovered over a name written in the margins. Danielle. It took a second to place it. Marie's closest friend, someone Jason hadn't thought about in years. Danielle used to be around the family all the time. Then, after 2009, she was just gone. No explanation, no goodbyes. She stopped answering calls, stopped coming to family events. Marie disappeared. And right after, Danielle cut all ties. Jason found an old contact in his phone. Her number, buried deep in his messages. He hesitated, then typed out a short text. It's Jason. I know what happened. Please call me. We waited. Minutes passed. Then the phone buzzed. A message popped up. I knew this day would come. Meet me at the diner on 8th Street tomorrow. No phones. Neither of us slept. Every sound outside Jason's apartment made us tense up. A car door slamming. Footsteps in the hallway. A creak from the pipes. At 7 a.m. we got in the car and drove to the diner. Danielle was already there, sitting in a booth at the far end. She looked different, older, thinner, tired. Her eyes darted around the room, scanning for something. Or someone. She didn't touch the menu. She didn't even look at us at first. Then, quietly, she spoke. Marie didn't just disappear, she was silenced. Danielle's voice was barely above a whisper. Marie had found something. Something she wasn't supposed to. She had been looking into the family business. Everyone knew my father and uncle were well off, but no one really questioned where the money came from. They owned businesses. Sure, investments. But it was vague, just enough information to make people stop asking. Marie started asking, and then, she started finding answers. Danielle didn't know everything, but she knew Marie was scared. She had documents, proof of something, financial records, offshore accounts, names. She had tried to tell someone, but she never got the chance. Marie had confided in Danielle right before she vanished. She had called her, voice shaking, saying she needed to leave town. She had proof. She was going to expose everything. Then, overnight, she was gone. The next time Danielle saw my father, he told her to never mention Marie again, so she listened. She cut all ties, she left the family behind and never looked back. And now, after 15 years, Jason and I were reopening the wound. Danielle's hands trembled as she reached into her bag and pulled out something small, a USB drive. Marie had given it to her for safekeeping. She had been too afraid to look at it, too afraid to know. Now, she slid it across the table to Jason. "Whatever is on here," she muttered. "It's what got her killed." Jason took it, his fingers closing around the drive. Danielle looked up, eyes full of something between fear and regret. "If you keep pushing," she said, "they'll come for you next." The waitress came by with the check, and Danielle slid out of the booth. She didn't say goodbye. She didn't even look back. The bell above the diner door chimed as she walked out, and just like that, she was gone. Back at Jason's apartment, we plugged in the USB. Files loaded onto the screen. Documents, scanned receipts, spreadsheets of bank transactions. The money trail was clear, millions of dollars moving between accounts. Some of the names were familiar, some weren't. Then we saw it. A folder labeled Grayson. We opened it. Inside was a photograph, a black and white image, grainy but clear enough to recognize faces. It was taken at the lake house. A group of men standing together. In the center, my father, my uncle, and a man we didn't recognize. But in the corner, half hidden in the shadows, was a woman. Marie. Her expression was stiff, uncomfortable, like she wasn't supposed to be there. And below the photo, a single name was typed out. Elliot Grayson. We had our answer. Now we just needed to find him. Jason and I knew we didn't have much time. We had Marie's letter, the financial records, and the photograph of my father, uncle, and Elliot Grayson at the lake house. But we needed more. If we were going to figure out what Marie had uncovered, we had to get back to the chest in the basement. We drove to the lake house after nightfall. The house was dark when we pulled up. No cars in the driveway. No lights inside. It looked empty. We moved fast, cutting through the trees toward the back entrance. Jason had brought a flashlight, but we barely used it, only enough to avoid tripping. The less light, the better. Inside, everything looked the same. The faint smell of old wood and lake water lingered in the air. The place was silent, except for the soft creaks of the floor under our feet. We headed straight for the basement. Jason tried the door, still unlocked from last time. We went in, stepping carefully down the wooden stairs. The chest was still in the corner. Jason dropped to his knees and yanked it open. Half of the documents were missing. Someone had been here before us. Jason rifled through what was left. A few old receipts, scattered notes, but the most important papers, gone. A creak sounded from upstairs. We both froze. Someone was in the house. Jason shut the chest, and we backed into the shadows. Footsteps moved slowly across the floor above us, steady and deliberate. Then, another noise. The stairs leading down into the basement groaned. Jason grabbed my arm, and we moved. We slipped through the side of the basement, taking the back stairs up toward the kitchen. The front door was too risky. Whoever was inside had come through that way. We reached the back entrance and slipped out into the night. Jason's car was parked a few yards away, but if we ran now, we'd be seen. We crouched behind a tree, waiting. The front door opened, and a figure stepped out, a tall man, dark suit, watching. Jason grabbed my sleeve and we moved low through the trees, staying out of sight. We made it to the car and slid inside. Jason turned the key without turning on the headlights. We rolled down the road in silence. When we finally turned onto the main road, I glanced in the side mirror. The man was still standing by the dock, watching us leave. The next morning, Jason's phone buzzed. A message from his building's security desk. A package was left at your door. No return address. Jason and I got to his apartment in under 15 minutes. A small brown envelope sat in front of his door. We took it inside and shut every lock behind us. Jason opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Typed, "Stop. Before it's too late." Jason turned it over. A list of names. At the top, Marie's. We scanned the rest. Some were names we recognized. Distant relatives, family friends, people we hadn't seen in years. Others, no idea. Jason grabbed his laptop and started running searches. One pattern became clear. Every single person on the list had one thing in common. They had all cut ties with our family, or they had disappeared. Jason called Danielle. Her voice was tense, sharp. She didn't even ask how we got the list. She already knew. "They know you're looking," she said. "You need to be careful." Jason read some of the names aloud. When he got to Elliot Grayson, Danielle went silent. "I don't know exactly who he is," she finally admitted, but Marie was terrified of him. Jason asked if she knew where we could find him. Another pause. Then, "Look up Grayson Holdings." Jason searched it immediately. A real estate listing popped up. An address. It was 2 states away. We had what we needed. Jason looked at me. We were going to find Elliot Grayson. The drive took us across 2 state lines. Jason barely spoke. his fingers tapping against the steering wheel as we passed miles of empty road. The address from the real estate listing led to a remote property, a gated estate in the middle of nowhere. The closer we got, the heavier the silence felt. No traffic, no houses, just endless stretches of trees. Then, finally the gate appeared. Tall, black iron, no intercom, no visible cameras. But we knew we were being watched. Jason pulled up and hesitated for a second before nudging the gate. It opened. We exchanged a glance, but didn't say anything. Whoever lived here already knew we were coming. The driveway stretched for at least half a mile, winding through thick woods before opening into a clearing. The house stood at the center, an old brick estate, massive but strangely quiet. No cars in the driveway, no movement in the windows. Jason barely knocked before the door swung open. A man stood there, mid-50s stature, sharp eyes, perfectly composed. He didn't look surprised to see us. "You're late." He stepped aside, motioning us in. Elliot Grayson. He led us into his study without another word. The room was lined with bookshelves, old records, and framed photographs. A fireplace crackled at one end, even though the room wasn't cold. Jason scanned the shelves, then froze. One of the photos showed my father and uncle, standing beside them shaking hands. "Grayson." Jason turned, his voice tight. "You knew my mother." Grayson nodded. "I knew she wouldn't stop digging. I knew she wouldn't make it out." He gestured toward 2 chairs. "Sit." We did. Grayson leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. "I knew you'd come eventually. Your mother tried too." The truth unraveled fast. Our family wasn't just hiding secrets. They were part of something much bigger. Grayson had been one of them. Years ago, Grayson had been deeply involved in the operation, money laundering, offshore accounts and fraud. He suspected there were deeper layers, but before he could fully uncover them, he got out, knowing that questioning too much would make him a target. Marie, however, was different. She had found new proof that even he hadn't seen. She found proof. Documents, financial records, evidence that could take them down. And she made a mistake. She confronted them. They gave her a choice. Grayson said, "Stay silent or disappear." She refused, so they erased her. Jason's grip on the armrest tightened, his breathing sharp. "The last time I saw her," Grayson continued, "she was scared. She knew she was running out of time." Jason swallowed hard. "Do you know what happened to her?" Grayson hesitated. "No," he admitted, "but I know where she would have gone." He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out an old folded piece of paper, a handwritten address. "She mentioned this place once," he said, "an abandoned property, owned by your family." Jason grabbed the paper, scanning it. "This is where she left it," Grayson said. "Whatever proof she had, it's there." Jason didn't hesitate. He was already standing. Grayson exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "You have one chance to walk away," he said. "If you keep going, there's no turning back." Jason didn't even look at him. "We're not walking away." I followed him to the door. We had a new destination. The last place Marie went before she vanished. The road to the abandoned property stretched through miles of empty fields. The GPS led us to a dirt path, barely visible, cutting through overgrown grass. Jason slowed the car as we approached a crumbling farmhouse, its paint peeling, the windows boarded up. It had been in our family for decades, yet we had never heard anyone mention it. The place looked forgotten, but someone had been here before us. The front door was unlocked. Inside, the air was thick with dust. Furniture was gone, walls stripped. The wood creaked under our steps. It was clear no one had lived here for years. Jason and I moved carefully through the house. We checked cabinets, floorboards, corners of the rooms, looking for anything Marie might have left behind. Nothing. Then at the back of the house, we found it. A single locked door. The rest of the house looked abandoned. But this door was different. It was new, reinforced. Someone had put it there recently. Jason ran his fingers along the edges, testing it. No handle, no keyhole. Whoever locked it didn't want it opened. We stepped outside, searching for anything that could break through. Jason found a rusted crowbar in the remains of an old barn. It took several hits before the wood splintered. Jason pushed the door open. The air inside was stale, cold. A small windowless room. A desk sat at the center. Old filing cabinets lined the walls. Papers scattered across the floor. And right on top of the desk, a tape recorder. Next to it, a handwritten note. "If you're reading this, I didn't make it, but you still can." Marie's handwriting. Jason pressed play. Her voice crackled through the speaker. "I found proof. I don't know how long I have, but if you're listening to this, you need to know the truth." She sounded tired, scared. She talked about how she had started digging into our father and uncle's business dealings, how she had uncovered fraud, shell companies, laundering money through fake businesses. She mentioned Elliot Grayson. "He tried to warn me, but I was too late." Jason clenched his fists as the tape played. Marie had tried to expose everything. She was silenced before she could. The tape cut off abruptly, but her last words sent a chill through my spine. "If you trust them, you'll end up like me." A loud crash outside. Jason and I froze. It sounded like a car door slamming shut. We weren't alone. Jason moved fast, grabbing the tape, loose papers, anything we could carry. I peeked through a crack in the boarded-up window. A black SUV had pulled up outside. Someone was stepping out. Jason grabbed my arm. We need to go. Now, we sprinted toward the back door. Boots hit the front steps. The house creaked under the weight of whoever had entered. We didn't look back. We ran through the overgrown fields, straight into the woods. Branches snapped around us. My chest burned as I pushed forward. Jason didn't slow down. Neither did I.
And we weren't waiting to see who had come for us.
All we knew was they weren't here to talk. Jason and I crouched low, hidden among the trees, as the black SUV idled in front of the abandoned farmhouse. The doors opened, and two men stepped out. One of them was my father. He didn't look around. He didn't call out. He simply lit a cigarette, the glow of the lighter flickering in the dark. You boys always were too curious. Jason tensed beside me. I could feel the anger radiating off him. His hands curled into fists. He wanted to go down there. I grabbed his arm. We were outnumbered. My father took a slow drag from his cigarette, exhaling smoke into the cold night air. He wasn't looking for us. He didn't need to. He knew we were watching. Marie didn't listen either. He muttered, barely above a whisper. He didn't say it to anyone in particular, just stating a fact. Jason lunged forward, but I yanked him back before he could do something stupid. This wasn't the time. My father and the other man walked toward the house. They didn't rush. They weren't worried. They already knew what they would find. The broken door, the missing documents. They stepped inside. Jason and I stayed low, barely breathing. A minute passed, then another, then a soft whoosh. My father emerged, holding a lighter. He flicked it open, the small flame dancing in the wind. Then he dropped it. A flicker of light, then fire. Orange flame spread quickly through the broken door, swallowing the papers we had left behind. Everything inside was gone in seconds. Jason's breathing grew sharp, but he didn't move. My father turned toward the woods. "If you have the tape," he said, loud enough for us to hear, "you better think long and hard about what you plan to do with it." His voice was calm, almost bored, like this was just another loose end. He was tying up. He hesitated for a moment, then flicked the cigarette away and turned to leave. "Because if you don't," he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The SUV doors slammed shut. The tires kicked up dirt as it pulled away. We didn't move until the taillights disappeared into the night. The second they were gone, Jason shot to his feet. "We can't let them get away with this." His voice was sharp, furious. We sprinted back to the car, our hearts still pounding. Jason turned the key in the ignition, speeding back toward town. I dug through the papers we had grabbed from the farmhouse. Most of it was useless. But then I saw it, an old bank statement. Jason glanced at it as I held it up. Large sums of money, offshore accounts. Everything was linked to shell corporations. Proof, we had something. But we also had a problem. If we took this to the police, my father and uncle would know exactly who had betrayed them. Jason tightened his grip on the steering wheel. He didn't care. "We're ending this." Before we made any moves, we called Grayson. He picked up after the first ring. There was no greeting, no small talk. "If you're calling me," he said, voice low, "then you already know what's coming." The line went silent. Then he spoke again. "You boys just signed your death warrants." Jason and I knew one thing for sure. We couldn't go to the police. Our father and uncle had too much power, too many connections. If we walked into a precinct, we might not walk back out. So we took a different approach. We went to the press. It took 3 days to find the right journalist. Someone independent. Someone who wasn't afraid to burn bridges. We met in a small motel outside the city. No names, no details over the phone. Just a location and a time. Jason laid out everything. Marie's recording. The offshore bank accounts. The fraudulent shell companies. The names of everyone involved. The journalist didn't speak for a long time. Then they took the files and left. There was no turning back now. 2 weeks later, the article dropped. Front page. National news. The headline was simple. Decades of fraud and corruption. How one family kept its secrets buried. The fallout was immediate, but not absolute. The article exposed enough to force an investigation, but my father and uncle weren't strangers to legal battles. The subpoenas were issued. The public turned on them. But we knew it would take more than one article to bring them down completely. By the end of the week, my father and uncle were in custody. Their associates started flipping. Names were given. Deals were made. The empire crumbled overnight. Not everyone took it well. Some relatives cut ties immediately. They called us traitors, liars, disgraces. Others, the ones who had always been afraid, reached out quietly. They thanked us, told us they had known something was wrong but had been too scared to ask questions. Jason didn't care about the backlash. The night our father was arrested, he drove to the cemetery. He stood over Marie's grave for a long time. Then finally he whispered, "You won." The last time I saw my father before he was taken away, he looked at me through the bars of his holding cell. His expression was calm, cold. "You'll regret this." He didn't yell. He didn't beg. Just stated it, like it was a fact. Was he right? Jason and I had done what Marie couldn't. We had exposed the truth. But had we really taken everything down, or had we just scratched the surface? A few days after the article was published, Grayson disappeared. No sign of struggle. No last words. He had always been careful. Always kept an exit plan. Maybe he knew this was coming. Or maybe he had never left the game at all. Like he had never existed at all. Then, a week later, Jason found an envelope slipped under his apartment door. No return address. No fingerprints. Inside, a single note. They're still watching. We tried to move on, but it never really felt over. We saw strange cars parked near our apartments, noticed people watching us a little too long in grocery stores. Jason stopped answering calls from unknown numbers. We both felt it, something lingering in the background. A presence, a reminder, that just because we had won one battle, didn't mean we had won the war. Then one night, Jason showed up at my door with a packed bag. I need to get out of here. He didn't wait for an argument. He had already made up his mind. He was leaving. New city. New name. A fresh start. I asked if he'd stay in touch. Jason just shook his head. He was cutting all ties, for his own safety. I stayed, maybe out of stubbornness, maybe because I wasn't ready to let go of the life I thought I had. But I knew one thing. Life would never be the same. The family tradition was over, and so was the lie that kept it alive.